Hey folks, George here. Now that we've discussed just war theory by two different just war theorists, first Thomas Aquinas, who gives us more traditional version of just war theory, and then Michael Walzer's legalist paradigm, which expands upon the more traditional just war theory by Thomas Aquinas, we've got a response by John Howard Yoder entitled "When War is Unjust, Being Honest in Just War Thinking." Now, Walzer and Aquinas, Yoder will say, thank you very much, along with so many others in this long tradition of just war theory, have given us so many interesting criteria of just war and justifications for waging war. Now let's look at these criteria from a real world perspective, please, Yoder is going to say. And does just war stand up to the real world? Well, we'll see what Yoder says, so I'll give you a heads up. Yoder is going to make us doubt that just war criteria are ever met. How does he start then? He says the ideas of just war theory are very broad and vague, and they can't be applied so easily. So, by the way, what is really necessary for just war theory? Well, he reminds us that intention is important in just war theory. But, Yoder asks, what about a just cause that doesn't have a legitimate authority? What about a legitimate authority, but it doesn't have the means to wage war? By the way, citizens and the leaders must conceive of the sacrifice that war will bring. And what if some citizens look at that sacrifice and say, it's not worth it? What if some citizens in some nations say it's not worth it? And let's be honest here, Yoder asks us. So frequently, the notion of necessity is used to justify so many things. There's already an unjustified, unreasonable bias that we all have for our own nation or our own people or our own ancestors, let's say, where my descendants hail from. Doesn't that bias make me think a little bit unreasonably about the justice of some war? Yoder poses that question, right? All of these questions, Yoder says, makes it very unlikely that reasonableness contributes to making these hard moral choices of going to war. Let's examine some of those just war criteria. That first criteria that he wants to examine is the criteria that waging war, must be a last resort. It must be a last resort. The claim, however, of last resort can't really be decided at the last minute or by one party. Recall that the United States referred to the atomic bombs that were used against Japan at the end of World War II. The United States referred to the atomic bombs as a last resort. But really, that was probably only one resort that anybody was thinking about: use the atomic bombs. Furthermore, economic sanctions and cultural sanctions are used, but they're used very clumsily. After all, international agencies like the United Nations, like peacekeeping forces, they're very poor at implementing these things. And sometimes, often, they actually fall into corruption, right? Some agencies, like let's say the CIA, anybody who knows anything about the Cold War, CIA and the Cold War, will recognize that some agencies actually escalate tensions rather than diminish these tensions. Those all put into doubt these questions of last resort and how justifications of last resort are appealed to by just war theorists, or at least by people claiming just war. Let's consider for a second strategies of nonviolence, the type promoted by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Non-cooperation with injustice has inspired many, and it's been effective. Martin Luther King Jr. did not wage war. He did not revolt against the United States. Mahatma Gandhi was a pacifist, and that pacifism led to the independence of India. Also, Yoder gives us the example of Manila in 1986, or Eastern Europe, right? The Iron Curtain fell in Eastern Europe without war. Without war. I am reminded of the more recent Arab Spring, where there were many protests and governments fell without much bloodshed. Now, did those stick? Well, that's a slightly different question. But the point here is that many strategies of nonviolence do have a history of working. Of course, Yoder's not a fool here. Of course he's going to admit that nonviolence doesn't always work. But neither does war. War doesn't always work either. And by the way, if a war doesn't work, even a just war, and it doesn't end up working, then it will have caused much more evil than good that it tried to promote. What does all of this illustrate? Why is Yoder offering all of these examples and evidence? This is all to illustrate that the notion of last resort must be taken quite a bit further than it usually does in the real world. Now let's move on to the question of authority. In this regard, authority typically means that there must be some institutional structures in place. The issue is, however, that the authority is not moral if they don't look for alternatives to war, right? Merely claiming I'm an authority, therefore I will wage war. That's typically what happens, as opposed to looking for alternatives to war. Often, too often, leaders shrug their shoulders and say, "Huh, we couldn't think of anything else, therefore war." That questions the notion of last resort. Next, Yoder asks us to question the criterion of proportion. That is, even in just war theory, it is acknowledged that the evil of war must be weighed against the good that it will cause. Yoder asks, what kind of reasoning does this involve? That is, how do you measure all of these dead people versus something like freedom? How do you weigh these two things? Oh, this many dead people is worth this much freedom. I don't know how to measure those things. Do you? Yoder is suggesting such a measurement, such a utilitarian calculus is unreasonable and impossible. How do you measure dead bodies versus something like freedom? And even if you try to claim, oh, this many dead bodies is worth this much freedom, fine, but there's always this utilitarian calculus which is just uncertain. There's just no certainty here. That is, how many dead people will actually die versus how much freedom will we actually have. All of that is uncertain. Therefore, that makes it that much more ridiculous in trying to weigh this good that the war will cause versus the evil that the war will cause. In light of this lack of certainty, the burden of proof, of course, morally, ethically speaking, must be on the people who claim to wage war. And by the way, what institutions do we have in place to reliably decide that just war criteria have been met? As far as I can tell, the criteria given by Walzer or Aquinas are not on some list somewhere, and they say, yes, yes, these have all been met, therefore we shall wage war. I don't see any democratic institutions doing that, right? And that is one of Yoder's big problems with just war theory in the real world. Let's consider, finally, Yoder asks us, consider what would be a fair test anyways, right? Consider, for example, the fact that so much money, so many resources are given to the war industry, right? Suggesting that war might be necessary. Have as many resources and has as much money been given to the preparation of non-violent responses? Yoder says, no way. We spend billions preparing for war. We don't spend billions preparing for alternatives to war. And thus, it doesn't seem fair, Yoder says, to compare these two options equally. They're not compared equally. They're not given a fair comparison in light of the fact that billions and trillions are given to the war industry, but equivalent money isn't given to the non-war or the alternatives to war industry. Recall, for example, the protests of the 1960s. Non-violence during the 60s only had 2 weeks to prove that it works. But waging war has had centuries to claim that it works. What is the takeaway from this article by Yoder? It seems to me that the key takeaway is that after all of these examples and considerations, the very fulfillment of just war criteria is probably never actually reached. It's never probably actually a last resort. You can never really calculate good versus evil that will come about as the result of war. And with those ideas in mind, what does that say about realistic application of just war theory? Well, I hope that you could appreciate that Yoder is trying to impose some sense of doubt in all of us regarding the justice of war. See you next time. Bye-bye.